Good morning. Welcome back. Yesterday we were talking about how plants are an essential part of this earth, and they create the air that we breathe, and they take in the air that we breathe and synthesize it so that we can breathe that oxygen back in again. We were talking about how everything on this earth needs the plants to function so that they can eat things, and those are some essential elements of plants. Now, there are so many different types of plants that it's really hard for us to identify them. So yesterday I said that there are a couple of different ways that people do this. It started with people just looking around and observing what was out there and naming things. And when you name things in human language, it varies between culture to culture. And so they decided to come up with a system called plant classification. And what they wanted to do was show that certain plants were very similar to other plants because most plants are so different from each other. What they wanted to do is start to clump them into groups that were similar and say this group is very similar, this group is very similar, this group is very similar. How can we take all these many different types of plants and start to make them more similar so that we can say that they're part of a group? So in plant classification, there are two major types of plants. You have plants that have flowers, and you have non-flowering plants. Now, the essential thing here is that the flowering plants are going to make seeds, and the seeds are going to make more plants. And the plants that are non-flowering plants are going to have to figure out another way to make more plants. And they can do that a number of different ways. As I said, some of them will just regrow themselves. So if you break off even a teeny piece, that teeny piece will grow. If you break off a little branch, or if you break off a little stem or something like that, it'll grow. Another way that they are going to create more is they are going to create spores. And the spores will either sink down in the water, or they'll get caught in an animal's fur and go off, or they'll actually explode into the air, and they'll use the air to transport these floating spores all over the place. And sometimes if you're feeling like allergies, or if you're getting like a toxin, like a mold toxicity sort of a situation, you could actually just be getting spores that are going into your body. We get spores all the time because there's a lot of microspores floating through the air. So in general, we have this one big group called plants. And then the two groups below plants are, you have the flowering plants that have seeds, and you have the non-flowering plants that don't have seeds. And then on top of that, it gets a little bit more complicated. You basically get into two more subgroups from the flowering plants that do have seeds. And you have a group called Gymnosperms, which have basically naked seeds. The seeds aren't covered up with anything too crazy. And you have angiosperms, which, when we break down the group of plants that does have flowers and does make seeds, those are going to be, for instance, like a sunflower, and it grows up, it has a stem, it has a root system, it stays firmly rooted in the earth, the stem holds it in the swaying in the air, then it absorbs that sunlight through the photosynthesis of the leaves. It's going to take in that sunlight, it's got all of those elements going for it, and then it's going to create this flower, this big, beautiful yellow sunflower. In that, you're going to find hundreds of seeds, these little sunflower seeds, which you can either eat, you can buy the shelled sunflower seeds, the kind that you chew on, and you have all these nice little seeds, or you can plant those things, and each one of those hundreds of seeds can actually become an entire another sunflower stalk. If somehow it makes it into the ground, gets a little bit of darkness, goes under the earth, dries out a little bit, and then gets a little bit of rain, gets a little bit of that water, gets a little bit of that sunlight and gets a little bit of warmth, stays in the earth, and it gets all those elements that's going to create another sunflower. You have another group as well. The other group, your conifers. These, the pine trees that you see out in the wild. You have all kinds of different pine trees, many different types. But their seeds are different. They don't necessarily make flowers, but they do make these pine cones, and each pine cone is filled with seeds, some of which are edible to us and edible to animals, and you'll see the animals collecting those things. They're filled with really healthy fats. So if you've ever tried pine nuts before, those are collected from the pine cones. Each one of those little thick bits of the pine cone that you fold on up is going to have a seed under it. So again, you're going to have hundreds of seeds in the pine cone as well. And each one of those seeds, with the right condition, can actually create a giant tree, which is pretty magical if you think about it. So that was one group, is you have your group that has the seeds, the flowers, and then you have no seeds, no flowers, and those plants are things like fungi and ferns and algae and mosses. So those are a little bit more shallow in the placement of time as far as how they're created, and we're going to go over each of those in more depth. In fact, we're going to start with those non-seed making things because they're a little bit more primitive. Some of them are very simple, from that algae that's actually just kind of like a floating leaf, and you've got hundreds of thousands of these things, just in one small little bit of ocean. So then you have millions of them, and you have billions of them all throughout the ocean. There's freshwater algae, there's like river algae, even seaweed. Those long stalks of seaweed are considered algae. So yes, we actually eat algae. Even if you don't eat spirulina, that blue-green algae, if you eat those yummy crunchy nori sheets, then you're also eating a form of algae. In addition, you have like ferns, and you have different mosses that just need a little bit of damp to grow. You have lichens that grow on top of things, and they just have these really shallow latching systems that we'll discuss more in depth. So that's in the complete other group of the things that don't make seeds, things that don't make flowers, but they can still be super duper beautiful. You still have all these different kinds of mushrooms, all these wonderful colors of lichens and mosses, and those emerald greens when you walk into a forest, and they can be from purple to yellow, red, pretty much all the colors of the rainbow you're going to find in all these other plants. So that's plant classification. Now, what is a plant? And just to step back, like, what are the major things that we're talking about in the world? You have animals, which we talked about in our zoology block. We have plants, which we're talking about now in our botany block, and we're going to talk about that study of plants, and I'll go over that more in just a second. And we have minerals, which we're going to go over next year when we start to study the earth a little bit in geology. And we have people. So those we will talk about more in like 7th grade. We'll talk about how people work and how what we know of how people work. So things that we're going to include in this plants section that for most of time that science existed, they did consider these plants are bacteria. Are just because they're not exactly a mineral, they're not an animal, they're not a person. So they just kind of lumped them into the plants category because there wasn't really another place for bacteria. And a couple of other small things like that. We'll get more into that in the future. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us. I have a little poem before we go. Kind hearts are gardens. Kind thoughts are roots. Kind words are blossoms. kind deeds are fruits. So for today, what I would love for you to do, take a little activity and get out in nature, even if it's just your front yard or your backyard. Just get out into nature, and your homework assignment is to just be quiet. Just be quiet, just be still, just observe, and start to focus on your senses. Focus on your sense of smell. What does it smell like out there? Focus on your sense of touch. Be safe if something looks like you probably shouldn't be touching it. Plants usually give you some pretty obvious cues that you should not be touching that plant, with some exceptions. But if you see a tree that's not poison oak, doesn't have that tri-tip on its leaves, go ahead and touch that. And what is that texture like? What does that feel like? Just like early in the year when I was asking you to use your description and in your words, I want you to go out and use your actual senses to observe these things that are out there. What are those feels? What does it feel like? What does that soil feel like? There's so many different types of soil, especially in all of your front yards and all of your backyards. And you're welcome to send in a photo if you'd like to send in a photo of like what are these things like? What does that feel? What does it smell like? Don't taste anything yet. We will get into that. I want you to be safe, so don't use your sense of taste yet, please. Unless it's your actual garden and you know what's out there and you know that you don't need to cook it. Thank you. And, okay. And what does it look like? Really just be still and observe it, and don't just glance at it. There's a difference between a glance and using your powers of observation. So please use your powers of observation to look at what's around you. Write it down in your journal that you created yesterday, and it's up to you. This is not going to be graded. This is not going to be looked at except by you. So just observe. Write down your observations, and I will see you guys tomorrow.